Well, welcome to our third session of Living Stories. Today we're going to talk about dangerous courage. I love these living stories that we've been sharing, stories from the Old Testament about real people living real lives, going through the same kind of temptations that you and I go through, and some of the experiences that we can take and we can apply to our life. This week when I was reading about Esther, we'll talk about her in a minute, I started thinking about when I was a little boy. On a rainy Saturday afternoon, when I couldn't be shooting hoops or playing pickup football with my friends, we would be stuck indoors, and sometimes we would turn it on Channel 2 in Nashville, that was ABC, and we would watch something called The Wide World of Sports. I don't know how many of you grew up watching Wide World of Sports, but every Saturday afternoon it would come on in Nashville, and they would show sporting events from all over the world. And the intro to that show, there was a phrase that said, "The thrill of victory," you remember that? "And the agony of defeat." How many of you remember what you were watching when it said the agony of defeat? It was a ski jump. It actually wasn't a ski jump, it was a ski crash. It was a man coming down this long slope, ready to take that ski jump, but somehow, some way, something happens. He loses control. His body becomes this contorting whirlwind of parts, and he's skis flying everywhere, and he's falling, and it was the agony of defeat. Well, I've often wondered, being someone that is terrified of heights, I don't even like being tall as I am, and why someone would get up on a really big mountain with sleds on their feet and slide down and then jump the length of, it was more than a football field, over 300 feet. Why in the world would somebody want to do something like that? And so I went online and I started looking it up, and I found this site, I don't know if I could ever find it again, it's called "You Too Can Be a Ski Jumper." And what they didn't know is that I too could never be a ski jumper. Because once again, I'm terrified of heights. But anyway, it starts talking about how they train ski jumpers. And what they do is they take these small children and they go over these little jumps, these little small ramps. They go over and they practice that till they land successfully. They take a little bit of risk. Then they get older, they take a little bit more risk, a little bit more, until finally they're on top of this huge mountain sliding down, jumping over 300 feet. It's really all about controlled risk. It's about taking a small risk, gaining confidence, taking the next risk, gaining confidence, and then taking the greatest risk with a great deal of confidence. You see, discipleship's a lot like that. Life is a lot like that. It's a series of risk-taking. Series of taking these risks, not these adrenaline junkie risks like going down a mountain and jumping 300 feet with sleds on your feet. It's that risk that pays off in big reward. Maybe it's accepting that job. Maybe you realize that if you hadn't taken that risk and asked that girl out, you wouldn't be married with 3 children now. It's taking those normal things that seem like big risks at the time, but they seem to turn out okay. But all of those risks take a great deal of courage. And what we find out in life is this, that risk-taking not only is a necessary part of gaining reward in life, but often risk-taking is the difference between living life and merely existing. And if you think back on your life, you probably will recognize that as different cycles in your own particular journey. That being ready to take those risks are the difference between living a full life and merely existing. This morning, I want you to understand that faith and risk are catalytic partners in growth. And what the word catalytic means is just a change agent. They change us to where we grow. But comfort is a place where faith goes to die. We need to be people who are constantly taking bigger risk. We are people who are constantly looking for how God can help us go through that next jump in our life. Because faith and risk are catalytic partners in us growing as disciples, but comfort is the place where faith always goes to die. And this morning's story's about that. It's about a woman named Esther. Now, in order to really get into the story, I want to give you some backstory relatively quickly. It's the story of Esther. It's only 10 chapters long. I encourage you to go home and read the entire story this afternoon. It'll take you 15 minutes. But the story of Esther goes something like this. There is a king by the name of Xerxes, and some translations may call him Ahasuerus. They're actually the same person. It's a long explanation. If you want to know, see me at Starting Point, I'll tell you. But there's a king named Xerxes. And Xerxes is a big-time player. He's incredibly wealthy. He's like the big daddy of Persia at the time. I mean, he's over everything. He's incredibly wealthy. And so he decides to have this enormous party because he wants to show off all his wealth. So he has a party. They party for days. And they get to a certain part of the party where Xerxes he's done a lot of 12-ounce curls. And so he calls for his wife, Vashti. Now, his wife is beautiful, one of the most beautiful women in the land, and he wants to call her in to show everyone her beauty. We don't know what that means, but we know that Vashti was having none of it. And so when they call for her, he sends 7 men to go get her. They come back empty-handed. She's not coming because she has some idea what he's got planned, and she's not in for this. And so they decide that since she disobeyed the king, that they would tell the king that he should banish her forever and do it with a royal writ that could not be revoked. Well, Xerxes is still somewhat inebriated. He decides that he'll do this. He banishes his wife Vashti from the kingdom, and when he comes to his senses the next day, he realizes that he's alone. And so he decides that he'll send his men out to find the next queen of Persia. And so they start canvassing the land, and they start gathering up these women by their will, against their will, whatever, and they're about to have the Persian version. I've never said it before like that, the Persian version. The Persian version of The Bachelor. They're all going to come in, they're all going to get their tryout, and he's going to choose the one he wants. Well, they come across this woman living in this kingdom. He's the king of 127 provinces, and this woman's name is Esther. She's a Jew. He has no idea that she's a Jew. But he brings her in, and she becomes part of this harem. And the women are coming through. You can imagine what the tryout is. I'll leave that to your imagination. She waits 4 years. 4 years. And finally, it's her turn to please the king. And all we know in Scripture is it says that he was pleased with her. And he decided that he would make her queen immediately. Thus, after 4 years, Esther becomes the queen of Persia, the queen to Xerxes, the king. Well, here's where the conflict in the story goes. See, the backstory of Esther is this. Esther is born a Jew. Her parents have died, and she's been adopted by her uncle, who's named Mordecai. And Mordecai is one of the lower officers in the king's court. He's one of the lay officers, people that are not necessarily part of the Persian Empire, but he uses them to do their work. And Mordecai has done great acts of valor already. He's already garnered the king's attention, and he's risen about as far as he can rise, being someone who is Jewish. But Mordecai is also someone who respects God above all else, although it doesn't tell you that in Esther, but what it does tell you is that there's a person who is the second in command by the name of Haman. And Haman is Xerxes' right-hand man, and when he enters into the official court, the people who stand outside, where Mordecai is one of them, are supposed to bow. Mordecai would not bow to Haman because that was showing honor to a man rather than honor to God. And so it just irritated Haman that he wouldn't bow. He would ask his officers, he'd say, why is this man not bowing? Well, he's not like us. Well, Haman was evil. And it wasn't just the kind of evil that wanted to hurt Mordecai. It was ultimately sinister to where he wanted to eradicate everyone like Mordecai. Anyone who might not be able to bow to him. Therefore, he planned to eradicate all the Israelites. And so what he does is he goes to the king, and he tricks the king into signing an edict to where in 12 months from then, all the other colonies, all the other groups would have an ethnic cleansing against Israel. They would go in and they would murder all of Israel. Well, eventually Mordecai hears this plan. I'm getting you to the 4th chapter, by the way. Mordecai hears this plan, and his heart's broken because he knows that this is extremely possible without the help of God, that this is something that could very well happen. He dresses in sackcloth and ashes. He mourns in the street. He's crying out loud. Meanwhile, Esther is in the king's castle, and she hears of her uncle Mordecai and his mourning and his wailing in the street. And so she sends someone to take him clothes, which he refuses to wear, and she wants to know what's going on. So Mordecai sends a message to her of what Haman's plan was to be, that the Israelites were going to be destroyed in 12 months. And he asked her to go into King Xerxes and to do something to change his mind. And it's at this time that she sends word back that would be too dangerous. That to go into the king's inner court without an invitation, and she hasn't been invited in there in over 3 months, that to go into his inner court would probably be sudden death. And I want you to hear the response from Mordecai. You find it in the book of Esther, chapter 4, and it's in verses 12 through 14. It tells us this. They related Esther's words to Mordecai, and then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther. Do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape more than any or all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have attained royalty for such a time as this. You know, we hear that phrase, such a time as this, so often. You know, maybe we're at this point for such a time as this. Maybe God's calling us to something for such a time as this. But I want you to understand the context of what's going on here. Number one, if we're called for such a time as this, it'll never be without risk. I'm going to say that again. If we're called to do something for such a time as this, it'll never be without risk, and it will always require dangerous courage. And the next thing I want you to know is that sometimes risk doesn't lie where we think it does. Because Mordecai's message to her is this: yes, it's dangerous for you to go to the inner court. Because if you go to the inner court, you may die. But if you don't go to the inner court, you may die anyway. It's you either take a gamble and try to do the right thing in order to save God's people, or you do nothing and you're all lost. That's a scary thought. That's a tough choice for someone like Esther. Tough choice for us. You think about Esther, she's sitting there, she's comfortable, she's the queen. It's obvious that she's found favor with Xerxes, and it would be easy to ignore the cries of her people. Because that's what comfort does. It's hard to hear people who are uncomfortable when we're comfortable. You know, we watch the television sometimes, and I know that I'm guilty of this. We'll see the pictures of the starving children in some other country, and just for pennies a day, we can feed these people, and I have to turn the channel because I just can't watch while I'm comfortable. It's the same way in Christianity. You know, we got ours. We have our church family, and we have this relationship with God. And I know that they don't have that, and they're crying for help. But you know what? I'm comfortable. And we have to understand sometimes that let me get this next thing out. Ignoring God's call is riskier than whatever risk He's calling us to take. We need to really get it in our minds, like Esther was really confronted with Mordecai. Ignoring God's call is riskier than whatever risk God's calling us to take. In this case, she was being called to take an enormous risk, to risk her own life in order to save those that she cared about. Her time was then. Her time is now. And so let's read her response, verses 15 and 16. It says, Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, Go assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens also will fast in the same way. Thus I will go to the king which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. There's a couple things going on here. She's decided that she's not going to do this by herself. That it would be incredibly unwise for her to go into this alone. And so what she asks these people to do is to take time to fast. And what went along with fasting was to pray for Esther. To pray for her success, to pray for this intervention with Xerxes, to pray. And she's doing something that we should all learn from. And that's this. So often as Christians, we want to be Lone Ranger Christians. Oh, my relationship's just between me and God. Or, you know what, I think between me and God, we can fight this thing alone or whatever. And you know what? We should never feel like the Lone Ranger is part of God's family. We've been put together as God's family for a reason, and that's to support one another. And anytime that we're called into a circumstance where we're going to have to take real risk, we need to enlist others on a supernatural level. We need to understand that that is at our disposal, that is at our command, that we can ask other people to petition God on our behalf on a supernatural level, because that's where the fight's really being fought. Remember, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers and powers and authorities and spiritual darkness. This is a fight on a supernatural level. Evangelizing our community is a fight on a supernatural level. But we can't do it alone. We need to encourage one another. We need to build a team around us. It's important that we work together in order to have dangerous courage and to take risk, to continue to save God's people. Solomon wrote this in Ecclesiastes. It says, two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. And in verse 12, it says, a cord of 3 strands is not quickly torn apart. You know, God has created us to need one another. That's part of being part of His family. That's part of being God's children. We need one another. And when we're asked to have dangerous courage and to take risk, that's what we're there for. We're there to encourage and to help one another. And Esther knew this. She knew that, yeah, I'll take the risk, and I'll have the courage, but I need to know you're behind me. When answering God's call to risk, you'll want the right people in your corner. And I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but if push comes to shove in your life and you're going to be called on to take a huge risk and you're going to be called on for dangerous courage, who do you want in your corner? Do you know who those people are? Do you have that relationship with those people? And would you call on them anytime, day or night, to say, you know what, God, I think God's calling me to do this. Will you pray with me? Will you be in my corner? Well, the story goes on. The other thing she says, I'll go in there, and if I perish, I perish. Basically, that means that if I die, I die. But I'll take the risk, I'll have the courage, and I'll walk in. And so the rest of the story goes that she enters into Xerxes' court. She dresses in her finest apparel. She goes into his inner court, and he holds up his scepter to point to her, so to say that she is okay, that she can approach him. And she comes up to Xerxes, and he says, what is it that you want? And his offer is astounding. He says, I'll give you anything up to half of my kingdom. Big deal. He obviously, he was pleased with her. I'll give you anything up to half of my kingdom. And she has a very, very simple request. She said, I'd like to have dinner with you and with Haman. And so he agrees to have dinner with her. They have dinner. And then she has dinner for a reason. She has dinner so she can invite them to dinner again. That's it. Something's going on here that we need to talk about. But before we talk about that, I want you to see a side note. Haman leaves that first meeting because what's happened is, by inviting her to go with the king and inviting Haman to go with the king to meet with her, meant that she was placing Haman on a level equal to the king. And the arrogant Haman could not resist. He went back, he told his wife how important he was, and he said, man, 12 months, we're going to get rid of all those Jews. I tell you what I want to do. I want to build a gallows 50 feet high because I want to personally execute Mordecai. So they build the gallows. And this all happens between the first meeting and the second. But here's what's going on. Esther is waiting for the right time. Waiting's hard, isn't it? Have you ever known that you needed to do something, or there's something that in your heart of hearts you really wanted, but you had to wait? See, she was waiting on just the right time and just the right season so that she could pique Xerxes' curiosity to just the right level to where she would have his complete attention. And so she waited. Now, before I get into the next thing about this, I want to talk about waiting for just a minute, how hard it is to wait. There are people here, I know for a fact, that you feel that God has a strong tug in your life, or there's something that you desire greatly and you're waiting for God. Maybe it's someone that, you'd love to be married, you'd love to be in a relationship, and you just haven't found the guy or the girl, and you're waiting. I want to encourage you to continue to wait, because while you're waiting, if that's God's will for your life, He's going to show it to you, and He is in the process of preparing someone for you. Maybe you're someone and you're wanting to have a family, have a child. Wait. Pray and wait. In the right time, He'll reveal His will to you, and maybe it'll be your own child, and maybe it'll be someone else's child. But if it's His will for you to pour your life into the life of another human being, He's going to give you the opportunity. You wait on God's timing, because we have to understand, and we're about to find out in this story, that God has His timing in anything that we do. Even if we do the right thing, if we do it at the wrong time, it becomes the wrong thing. I'm going to repeat that. If we do the right thing at the wrong time, it can become the wrong thing. We have to wait on God's timing, and that's what Esther's doing here. She's waiting on that timing. And so the thing I want us to see here is that when applying your faith to God, a God-sized risk, timing is everything. Wait on God's time. And so I want to finish this story. The next night, they're called together, and we see what happens at this last dinner. In Esther 7, verses 1 through 6, and then I'll tie it all together in just a minute. It says, now the king and Haman came to drink wine with Esther the queen. Once again, Haman thinks he's a big deal. And the king said to Esther on the second day, also, as they drank the wine at the banquet, what is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half the kingdom it shall be done. Then Queen Esther replied, if I found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me as my petition, and my people as my request. For we have been sold, and I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Now, if we had only been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have remained silent. For the trouble would not have been commensurate with the annoyance to the king. Then King Xerxes, Ahasuerus, asked Queen Esther, who is he, and where is he? Who would presume to do thus? And Esther said, a foe and an enemy is the wicked Haman. Then Haman became terrified before the king and the queen. He's been outed. He thinks he's a big deal. But she was right there, face to face. And what she's doing now was even more dangerous than going to the inner court. She was accusing his right-hand man of treason, of tricking the king. And he became afraid. Now, the rest of the story goes like this before we get the application. It's a pretty simple story. Haman is hanged on the 50-foot gallows that he had made for Mordecai. Nothing like poetic justice, right? Mordecai is raised to the position of Haman. And the Israelites are not only saved, on the same date that they were set to be executed, they became conquerors and vanquished all their enemies in that land. Happy ending, right? The question is this, what does this have to do with us? What does this mean to you and me? The lesson is about God's family. It's about preserving and advancing God's family. You see, the book of Esther is one of the most unique books in Scripture. And here's why. God is never mentioned. You read it from first verse of chapter 1 all the way through chapter 10. It never refers to God. But God is in every step of the book. God is in every plot turn and every twist of the book, because this is not just about God, it's about us and God. It's about us being able to trust God when He's calling us to do something that seems bigger than who we are. It's about us being able to trust God when He is going to call us into a place where we're afraid. And when we get to the point where we're being called to do something in God's kingdom, which we're all called to do something, we all have a calling, we all have a purpose. The question we have to ask is, do we have the courage? Do we have the courage to take huge risk? Do we have the courage it takes to be who God is calling us to be? Do we feel a sense of urgency? Not stepping outside of God's timing, but going along with God's timing, that when the door opens, we're ready to run in. Do we have that kind of faith? Because faith and risk are catalytic partners in our growth. But if all we do is feel comfort, if we do what Esther could have done, which is to say, you know what, Mordecai, I got mine, you get yours. I'm the queen and life is good. If we do that, then comfort is the place where faith will grow to die. I want you to understand that when we're answering the call to such a time as this, God is bigger than the risk of any size. God is bigger than any risk of any size. We worship a big God. He was at work in the life of Esther. He's in the work of your life as well. When I was a kid, another one of my kid stories. I've told this story before. Some of you have heard it, I know. My brothers and I, my family, we went on vacation. We were at a pool, and we were at one of these swimming pools that had a high dive, 8-foot high dive. Well, once again, afraid of heights, right? 8 foot could have been 50 feet for me. I don't know. I mean, an 8-foot high dive. And my brother was jumping off of it. His friends were jumping off of it. And they finally chided me into going up the ladder. I mean, it was all I could do to get up that ladder. And I remember walking up there. And I walked out to the edge, which I'm nervous right now doing this, but I walked out to the edge of the board. And I looked at the water. And I looked at the ladder. And I looked at the water. And I looked at the ladder. And I was torn. I wanted to get down. I just didn't want to go that way. And all of a sudden, I saw my dad swim out into the water, into the deep end. And he's out there and he says, "Joey, jump." What do you think I did? See, at that point, it was no longer about the board. So when my dad got out in the water, it was no longer about my friends. When he was in the water, it was no longer about that sudden stop hitting the water, or the fact that I was going to go under, and I really don't like to be underwater. It was about, do I trust him? And you see, I jumped. And I knew when I jumped I was going to go under the water, and I don't like being underwater. But here's what I also knew. Yeah, I'll go underwater, but he won't let me stay there. No matter what happens, no matter how this goes, whether I bust a leg, whatever happens when I jump these 8 feet between this board and this water, I'll go under, but he won't let me stay there. And when it's time for you to take a step of dangerous courage, when it's time for you to take a huge risk, remember that you may go under, but he won't let you stay there. I jumped off that board, Not because I just trusted them there, but because there had been small events of trust that had built me to the point that I had faith in him at that point. Your journey with God is going to be the same way. He's going to call you to risks that are smaller, and then a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger. Don't ignore the risk, but don't fail to have courage. You may go under, but you won't stay there. Now, I said all that to say this. At Clear Creek Church of Christ, we do one thing. We find people that don't know Jesus, and we bring them into a life-changing relationship with Jesus. And what we do is important. And I'm not so sure that we feel a sense of urgency about that. I'm not so sure that we're not real comfortable. That it's a whole lot easier to talk to our friends, a whole lot easier to go about our day than to think about that there are people out there who need to be part of God's family that aren't. And if we don't do something about it, we may be their only contact with who God is. I want to encourage you to find those people. I want to encourage you to build those relationships. It'll take courage. It won't be comfortable. It won't be easy. But I want to encourage you to reach those people because they need to know Jesus. We find people who don't know Jesus, and we bring them into a life-changing relationship with Jesus by connecting them with God and with each other. Let's pray together. God, your calling is huge, but you're bigger. As a church, our prayer is that we take risk, that we're not afraid, and that we have the courage to step out on our faith. May we know that you're going to continue to put opportunity upon opportunity in front of us to take risk. And my prayer is that we will trust you in all things. We trust you because of your Son and what he's done and who he is and what he means to our lives. And it's in his name we pray, and amen.